This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. So thrilled to have you here with us tonight for our continuing virtual author event series, which we have been doing for a little bit over a year now. I need to do the numbers, but we're right around 150 of these, what we've done in that time. And it's been a really good way to stay connected with all of you and talk about books and kind of have a tether to our audience. But I'm excited to say that in July, we'll be doing our first in-person author event in quite some time. So we're going to start easing our way back into some of those types of things. So just stay tuned. You can see our website for that. But I will say just quickly, a lot of stuff coming up in the next few weeks. Of course, leading up to the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, which is May 31st, June 1st, kind of those couple of weeks before and after that, we have probably a good dozen programs kind of tangentially related to that or directly related to that. And that's everything from Don Lemon from CNN. We're going to be doing events with Scott Ellsworth for his book launch for his new book. And he wrote Death in a Promised Land, which was kind of one of the landmark books in the 1980s written about the then called the Tulsa Race Riot. So a lot of things coming up. Check our website. We'll put a link here in the chat so you can see our full upcoming calendar. But I would encourage you to join as many of those as you can. Really excited about tonight. Always like talking about Bob Dylan. You know, we'll talk about how the enduring conversation about Bob Dylan, but tonight we're going to get into some really broad stuff, but we'll also talk about some of that nerdy minutia that all of us Dylan heads like to talk about too. But I'm really excited. Sean Latham is a friend. We've been buddies for some time, and I would say it would be an understatement to say that he wears many hats. So, you know, Sean, of course, is a professor at the University of Tulsa. He is the editor of the James Joyce Quarterly. He is the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, which I've been really proud to be part of over the years. And of course, when the Bob Dylan archives came to Tulsa and there was this joint relationship with the University of Tulsa, there was going to have to be this academic side, this curriculum side. How was it going to be handled at the university? And of course, you know, Sean certainly had nothing else going on in his life and said, hey, I'll take that too. And has been kind of overseeing the university side of the archives and using that. And, you know, I remember when he first got a chance to say he was going to be teaching a Dylan class, like what a trip, you know, you never think coming up that someday you're going to be teaching a class on Bob Dylan, especially in Tulsa. So we're going to talk about this wonderful new book, The World of Bob Dylan, which Sean has edited, and is just a wonderful collection of essays that cover kind of, you know, like it says, the world of Bob Dylan. There's so many phases, there's so many periods, there's so many ups and downs, you know, all these different things. The collection of writers you put together is quite stunning. This is just coming out from Cambridge University Press. We'd encourage you guys to pre-order the book tonight. You can do that. We'll put a link in the chat right here. The book drops technically on the 24th, which is Bob Dylan's 80th birthday, but you'll actually be able to get it a little bit before that. So I would encourage you to pre-order your copy now. And if you have questions while we're talking tonight, drop those into the Q&A and I'll pull some of those while we're going and get those into the mix. But yeah, welcome, Sean. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Like I said, or as you said, we've known each other for a long time and co-hosted lots of events together as part of the Humanities Center. So it's actually fun to be here as one of the people being hosted for an event. All down to Bob Dylan.
Yeah, it's nice. Let's turn the mic inward for once. Well, you know, I'm curious to know, the archives have been here for a few years now, and obviously the Bob Dylan Center is underway, which will be kind of the physical manifestation, the public-facing component of that, which will be downtown in the Arts District. But tell me, you know, when did this first land in your plate? Like, you know, there were rumors about it for a while, but when did you kind of get word that, one, it was coming to Tulsa, and two, that you would have a role in kind of being part of this?
Well, as I like to tell people, like, you know, some people come to Bob Dylan, but I've been fortunate. Like, Bob Dylan came to me. You know, as you know, I'm here in Tulsa in part because of my interest in James Joyce, and that's really what brought me and my family here 20 years ago now. And in 2016, really 2015, I suppose, my university president at the time stood up and asked me to come into his office, and he said, "I've got some news for you. We're acquiring the Bob Dylan archive jointly with George Kaiser Family Foundation. And in looking across campus, you seem to be the guy who knows how to spend all his time focusing on one person. So, is this a person we should be focusing on? Are you interested in helping us sort of lead the efforts around thinking about what the university's role and responsibility is in relationship to this material? So, almost overnight, I needed to become a Bob Dylan fan, and almost just as quickly a Bob Dylan teacher and scholar. I was born in 1971, which means my musical taste sort of took shape in the late 80s, which is generally considered the sort of trough of Dylan's creative output. He was not a voice you heard on the radio, maybe on classic rock radio stations, you'd hear it, Everybody Wants to Get Stoned or something like that. But, he wasn't we didn't wait for the next Bob Dylan album to drop. That was not a part of my upbringing. And so he wasn't really a living musical presence for me. So this was a thing that I kind of had to come to, as I said, he kind of came to me, and I spent the last 4 or 5 years now just digging deeply into this material, and it's incredibly rewarding. He's the James Joyce of the second half of the 20th century. So I feel lucky. I've got the whole 20th century covered, the two most important artistic figures in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think we should say he's a Nobel Laureate. This is a winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, which controversially somewhat, but he did do that a few years back. I also kind of came to Dylan. What's really funny about this is I know the moment that I fell in love with Bob Dylan, because he wasn't part of my life either growing up. I knew who he was, and I knew kind of the countercultural tropes of Bob Dylan, right? My parents liked Bob Dylan, that was the kind of thing, that I knew about. But I remember when I was 19, so I'd made it pretty much to 19 without ever deep diving into it. And then I was at a Borders bookstore, remember those? And one day I was just kind of, how you used to I would just spend hours looking through CDs and stuff. And I just kind of came across Bob Dylan, and I remember thinking what do I know about Bob Dylan? I just didn't know anything. I was like, well, so I asked the person there, when you had knowledgeable kind of music nerds in the store, and I said, where should I start? And they handed me a CD of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, which was his second album, but of course kind of seen as the breakout album. And they had those things where you could scan the CD and listen to it on headphones there. And so I scanned it and I listened to Girl from the North Country. And it kind of just literally was this wow moment for me. And I spent the next, 20 years kind of chronologically going through it and becoming somewhat of an obsessive about it. But it's interesting that I think everyone who has come to him, or like you said, he came to you, there have been those moments. So I'm curious for you personally, when Dylan came to you, what was the first music beyond that opportunity that the late Stead Upham gave you that you kind of connected to on just a purely musical basis?
Well, I would say, at least in some sense, it was in high school, and I listened to a lot of classic rock radio stations at the time, and I couldn't believe it. I grew up in Colorado Springs, so a very conservative town. I'm probably as conservative as Tulsa was at the time, and you could turn on the radio and you'd hear Everybody Must Get Stoned come out of the radio, and even in 1985, I still couldn't believe you could put that on the radio. It kind of blew me away, and this let me think that this was somebody that was doing something really different. And so from that song, I then got, I didn't start at the beginning. I sort of started in the middle with the Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits album, volume 2, which was this amazing collection of those sort of 60s albums, and some of the stuff from the 70s. And I think those are the songs that I really started to connect to. Tangled Up in Blue has always been with me. It's always this song that's super fascinating in the way that it's built. Even as a kid, I sort of knew it was just different. It wasn't trying to tell a story. It was trying to build a picture in your brain, and it changed depending on how you listened to it or looked at it. And I absolutely loved that about the song. And I also knew some of Dylan's Nashville connections. That was country music was sort of what I grew up on and what was played in my house. And so I knew about this kind of vague connection between Dylan and Johnny Cash, and Johnny Cash was sort of a personal hero of mine as a kid. I had a lot of Johnny Cash 8 tracks growing up, and so I knew that there was even though they seemed worlds apart to me, I knew that there was something important here about the stuff that I got out of Johnny Cash, that he was close friends with Dylan. There was something there that was worth digging into, even though it took me a long time to sort of figure out what that connection might actually be.
One of my ongoing conversations I've always had with my friends or just colleagues or even people I work with is, when we'll have a moment to kind of deep dive into an artist or a filmmaker or a musician or an author. I always say, if someone has a big body of work, Dylan of course does, I start separating things out into my favorite things and then the things I think are the true big achievements, and they're rarely the same things.
Yeah.
The things that I connect to are kind of, it's maybe for personal reasons or I came to it at a certain time in my life. And so my favorite Bob Dylan album is Nashville Skyline.
Oh yeah.
For myriad reasons, but I know for a fact that it's not even in his top 5 albums, in terms of importance, cultural significance, all those things. And so I'm curious, as you've kind of come to know his work better, do you have something that you kind of embrace that you kind of know is not like top tier Dylan, but you just personally love it a lot?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know about that, because I think because of the way my brain and probably my profession works, like I tend to think about stuff as the stuff I really love and the stuff that's really teachable, and those aren't always the same thing, right? So for me, Highway 61 Revisited, that whole album, I just love it. I'll put it on anytime. I love to listen to it really loud, and I love the song Highway 61. I think it's an amazing rock song.
Got that great whistle, that thing.
Yeah, totally. Like, and it's just so smart, and it's apocalyptic, and it's like, it captures a ton of rage that certainly I was feeling growing up in a conservative town. It's, even if it was 20 years after the fact. But Love and Theft, that album that was released like eerily on September 11th, 2001, I think is the most teachable album in the world. Like, I love to teach it to students. They never have heard of it. They don't know much about it, but it's a sort of different Dylan. Like the Dylan in the earliest career it's kind of still a romantic poet or an expressive poet. I mean, he's really trying to say some stuff. And the later Dylan is Dylan the researcher, Dylan the historian, the guy that, as you go, when you look into his notebooks and the archive and stuff, you see that there's just like, every song is the tip of this vast iceberg of Dylan's reading and thinking and listening and exploring and remixing stuff. And that album, like every single song on it, is just like a deep dive into American history. So it's just this amazingly teachable thing where you can just give a song to a student, tell them, start looking up the words in this on Google or Spotify, listen to the song titles that are mentioned in there, and they just get this whole panorama really of Dylan thinking especially about issues of race and racism and the sort of fundamentally racist foundation on which most of American popular music rests, the old minstrel shows. Like, he really thinks hard about it, and that makes it a real joy to teach and still a joy to listen to, and sort of say, here's somebody who's thinking really hard about the legacies of the art forms that we enjoy unproblematically. They're never unproblematic. They're never without history of their own.
Speaking of teachable, and I think it's also funny, people, I think, love to, especially for artists, he's going to be 80 years old, on the 24th of this month. And people kind of always love to kind of say, well, that's probably his swan song, or that was his last great thing. And that's happened for like every one of the last several albums. It's been like, well, that was probably he peaked, But, you talk about teachability, and you also talked about that kind of anthropological side of Dylan, which he has become kind of like since Love and Theft, really. That song he put out last year, which I thought was like a highlight of 2020, which was Murder Most Foul, which is this like 17-minute song about JFK's assassination, but also it's like this panorama of pop cultural references over the last 50 odd years and all these things. And almost like a short story. I mean, it's barely sung. It's kind of more of but in terms of kind of being a culmination of kind of that work that he's been doing since that period of Love and Theft, what do you think about that piece in terms of kind of where he is at the moment?
I mean, I'll say that song and then the album that it appeared on, Rough and Rowdy Ways, he totally screwed me. I'd written this great introduction to this book, in fact, where I had an essay that was about Dylan's songwriting, and it ended with what I thought at the time was a brilliant, because we all think our writing is brilliant, a brilliant little piece about the song that he wrote for his last album of original music before that, which was called Tempest, clearly taking the title from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and where, Shakespeare's last play. And it's also about the sinking of the Titanic. And the Carter family's last song was about the sinking of the Titanic. Like, it all made sense. Dylan's last song was this thing that sort of brought together Shakespeare and the Carter family, Johnny Cash, all that stuff. Like, all of these endings around what was then this big popular cultural moment, the centenary of the sinking of the Titanic. And I had this great meditation about how here was Dylan sort of doing what he did, high culture, low culture, pop culture, all mixing together musically to create his sort of breaking of the wand and burying it, just like Prospero does in The Tempest. And it was all working, and this thing was in press, and then he releases Rough and Rowdy Ways out of nowhere, and my piece didn't work so well anymore. Like some hasty edits on the proofs to try to say I could no longer say it was his last album of original music, because that album is amazing. I mean, it's I have to say personally, I mean, I'll just say this as a personal opinion. I'm not a huge fan actually of the Kennedy song. Just because it's not really of my era. I've heard many people react to it really emotively, but I think there are some other really great songs on that album. There's one about Key West. There's one that's called The Pirate Philosopher that I think is a really interesting meditation on the end of life. There's another one called Crossing the Rubicon, which again does that thing Dylan does where you can mix up like classical Greek culture or Roman culture with popular sound, and then it's just an amazing song. Dylan's genius in his late stage of his career is as a remixer of culture, like to just pull all of that stuff together. Say there's no longer this thing called high culture, pop culture, mass culture. It's all culture. It's all here for us to take from. And the great artist is the one that can mix it together in a way that lets that kind of history speak through, even while you make something new. And I think that's what he really does in Rough and Rowdy Ways.
You know, one of the words and phrases that are thrown around so much these days, sometimes with, I think justified purpose and other times not so much, is this concept of cultural appropriation. And I think no one signifies how that could be mistakenly applied to, but also totally misunderstood as Bob Dylan, right? He certainly does do that in a certain sense, especially in these later years, where you're looking at traditional blues music and things like that. But that's rock and roll, right? Rock and roll in and of itself is a cultural appropriation in a certain sense. But how do you see him kind of fitting into the modern conversation about who owns what music and who gets to kind of tell people stories and all those kinds of things?
It's a super complicated and interesting question. It's curious to me that this hasn't been more of a debate around Dylan, because it's one that I'll stage in my class. Because the first thing we'll do is play. I mean, you mentioned the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan as his kind of breakout album. His first album was just called Bob Dylan, and it was an album of covers. And Dylan, among other things, is an incredibly, especially before his sort of wore out his vocal instrument, Dylan was an incredible mimic. So he's one of those guys, I'm profoundly jealous of, who supposedly could like listen to an album once or twice and then play every song on it and play it in the style of the people that performed it, right? I mean, he didn't read music, and when you look at the notebooks, he doesn't work with a musical staff. I mean, he sort of, it just comes to him. And it comes to him not just on the instrument, but in his vocal instrument as well. And when you listen to that first album, it is Dylan sort of singing the musical history that's interesting to him, which at the time is really the blues. And he'd never get away with releasing those songs today. He is, to borrow a quote from a critic named Jennifer Stover, he's sounding blackness. He's pretending to be black, right? I mean, he sounds black. He's trying to sound like Blind Lemon Jefferson, whose album he'd listened to before he performed this. And in some sense that could come across as terrible. And when I first present it to my students, they're often like, "Ooh, this is super uncomfortable." Exactly what you said. This feels like cultural appropriation. I don't know, shouldn't we cancel Dylan or something like that, right? But in a sense, like it's a sort of Dylan going to the woodshed. I mean, in the sense that as a practice space, right? He's learning these sounds, he's incorporating them, he's understanding them as American sounds. They're not black sounds or white sounds. You can't really think about them in terms of that kind of purity, that only black people can sing the blues, I guess, and only white people can sing crooning love songs. That's not really how it works, right? Like culture is always made from contact and mixture. And so I think what you hear in Dylan is him sort of plumbing those depths. And to his great credit, and one of the things that makes Dylan the guy that's going to last from this period, I think more even than somebody like the Beatles, certainly more than somebody like Paul Simon, is he takes an honest measure of what that meant. As I said earlier, it's him thinking about the racist history of the blues, thinking about the racist history of pop songs and minstrel shows, and he never stops thinking about it. His greatest song, in my view, is a song called Blind Willie Mctell that he didn't release in 1985. And it took him 10 years to release it. And it's a song that's exactly about this. That's about, what does it mean that like this music that I love and that I want to perform and that I want to sing trades on racist stereotypes, racist sounds, and always has. And that to me is the mark of a great artist, is that he doesn't, it's not for Dylan a question of did I appropriate it or not, it's that he's going to wrestle with it in every single album he makes. It's a question for him. It's a problem. It's not a question of ownership or not owning. It's a question of being involved in a tradition we can't escape, we can only live with. And Dylan himself has whatever inconsistencies we may find across Dylan's long career, his commitment to civil rights has been there from the moment essentially that he arrived in New York to right now. That's a deep and abiding commitment that you hear in the music and you see in the kind of work that he's done.
As we I want to talk about the book, and I'm curious, when you think about Dylan, he seems like someone who has always shunned examination and does not like to explain himself, does not like to explain his purpose, his songs. At the same time, he is the person that kept all this stuff for the archive, right? So there was an awareness of posterity. He could have easily thrown all this stuff away, burned it. If you really didn't want your life examined, you could have not had any of this stuff. There's a contradiction of sorts there. So when you're teaching Dylan, and you think like, would he want me to be teaching? Like, what would he think about his stuff being taught? Do you ever think about that?
Yeah, I suppose you kind of have to. And I don't think he's opposed to his stuff being taught. I think how it's taught might worry him a little bit. Like, I think one of my favorite Dylan moments, of course, is because it intersected with Tulsa. We'd announced the acquisition of the archive here. Dylan came on tour through here, and just a few days before that, he'd been awarded the Nobel Prize, right? And then he plays the Tulsa Theater downtown. Doesn't say a word, did not get back to the Nobel Committee, right? He wins the most prestigious literary award in the world. And for 2 weeks, he doesn't even respond to them. They try everything. I think they sent him a telegram, right? Like phone calls, just completely silent. And then in his Nobel acceptance speech, I think quite generously, he sort of ends it by saying, I'm not sure I want to be remembered as a literary person. I'm a performer. I want my music to live on, my words to live on in performance, not on the page, right? That's where they belong. And I think to me, this is one of the most important things about Dylan is that commitment to performance. And I think that actually can tell us something rich about the archive. Here's my underlying theory of the archive. One, it doesn't really start until 1966, which is when he gets in the motorcycle accident. He settles down. It may be Dylan that's saving that stuff. It may be some people that are living around him at the time that are like, this is a famous guy. We should be saving his stuff, right? We should just be putting it somewhere. And it's clear at some point that it's not just that Dylan is collecting that stuff with an eye toward posterity. It's, as I've looked into the notebooks from that 1966 period, and I've read them all and looked at them really closely. Dylan is, at that point, he's trying to decide, and you actually see him do this in the notebooks, should I rewrite some of the old songs? Like he adds alternative verses. He comes up with some response songs to his old music. He's using his archive. It's not there just for posterity. It's there as a creative resource. And what you see emerge when he comes back out of the basement eventually is not rewriting the old songs, but performing them constantly in a new style. It's one of the pleasures of going to a Bob Dylan concert is like the surf rock kind of boogie starts, and all of a sudden you realize it's like a Rolling Stone, like concealed within a completely different musical arrangement. And I think what you're hearing and seeing there is Dylan going back to his archive and seeing it not as a museum piece for somebody like me to come study, but as a creative resource that it's not done yet. It still has more lives. And for me, this is like ultimately what separates Dylan from Joyce, right? There's no such thing as a cover version of Ulysses, right? And Dylan's music is going to live on maybe longer than Joyce's writing, because any other artist can go in there and find something, find a new way to perform it, move the lyrics around, do the blues tradition. That's what the blues does, is go take familiar standards and sort of rearrange them. And I think that's what we see in Dylan. That's my way really of understanding Dylan's relationship to the archive. This is his creative resource, not precious commodities like the way Joyce treated his notebooks as museum pieces to be saved and sold, but as a living resource that Dylan's still mining. And I wouldn't be surprised if for this new album, he'd gone back to look at that old stuff before writing these new songs.
That's so interesting, actually, the way you say that. It makes me think about in terms of purposes of archives, because now it's like, yeah, it's true. It's like now you would just have like a Dropbox on your computer But back then it was just a box. You needed somewhere to keep stuff, right? To
Yeah.
reference. I think on our computer we have hard drive and all these places where we just keep stuff. So yeah, it might not have been like, yeah, this master plan. It's just a place to kind of dip back into occasionally. That's pretty fascinating. I'm curious, when you first got a chance to start looking through this material, had it been sorted in any way, or was it a total like dive in and try to figure it out? Like had there been some organization done to it for the most part?
Yeah, I mean, the first volume, I'm of course aware that representatives from the archive, I'm sure, are watching tonight. So I may get some of the details here wrong, and I imagine if I do, they'll hopefully say something in the Q&A session. My sense is that Dylan himself had begun digitizing and organizing this archive, or at least Dylan's representatives had been doing this, and it created a digital edition for themselves. So there'd been that level of organization, and the first catalog that I saw for this material was a 3-ring binder that the university president handed me, and was it was a seller's inventory, really. It's not really an academic catalog. It was a sort of, here's what it is, and as best as we can describe it, and this may be the order it's in, we're not sure. One of my friends and the librarian for the Dylan Archive, a guy named Mark Davidson here in Tulsa, has been sort of recataloging it, making it into a thing academics can use, not a thing booksellers can use to sell a thing, but like better describing it, better understanding its depth, complexity. I think, and again, I hope I get these numbers right, because I'm sure Mark's listening, is, when you read about the Bob Dylan Archive, it says there are 100,000 objects in the archive. But my understanding is there is something like 800,000 entries in the catalog, right? Because what constitutes an object is a really complicated thing for literary scholars. Is that there are stems for every recording, like for many of the recordings. Like, so you want to hear the drum stem from one version of Like a Rolling Stone. Well, is that an object or just part of an object, the Rolling Stone object? So that should give you some sense of how complicated it is just to put a thing like this together. There are many different ways to create archives, and the heroes in this whole story are people like Mark, who've transformed it from the way you and I might organize our papers to a thing that people like me, academics, students, teachers, researchers, can come in and say, I want to know how Rolling Stone got made. And through digital catalogs, you can sort of pull all those pieces together and see all the different places they might live in an archive like this. So it's an amazing process to see that process of transformation from collection of catalog of stuff to actually usable academic archive.
Let's do a couple of questions. We've got a couple here. One is from Cheryl, who says, will there be a public exhibition in Tulsa of the Bob Dylan archives? I will say there was a partial show at Gilcrease a couple of years back, which was kind of a little sampling of that. It certainly wasn't everything, but I know the Bob Dylan Center, of course, will be eventually where people will see a public display of some of these. Correct?
Yeah, and that's going to be housed in downtown. You can see they've got a teaser sign outside of it. I think it says something is happening here. It doesn't follow on with what it is ain't exactly clear rest of the lyric, but it's going to be down. I mean, if you're in Tulsa, it's in the place where Philbrook downtown used to be. So it's going to be right there by Woody Guthrie Center. And that'll be the public face of the archive, as I understand it. I'm not associated with that project directly, but I was talking to the people that were earlier today, and they made sure to tell me that if this question came up, to say we should expect an announcement from them in a few days, potentially, about when that center will be opening and what kind of access it will be providing to some of these materials.
Yeah, and that's going to be, it's kind of bookended with the Woody Guthrie Center, so people will have a chance to kind of see both those. Of course, there's a huge connection. You mentioned the first Dylan album, between him and Woody Guthrie, so that was obviously a purposeful connection there. So the world of Bob Dylan, there have been few musicians or artists covered as much as Bob Dylan. Of course, there are, I'm sure, as you've seen and read ad nauseum books about him. What were you trying to kind of get at with this? What was like the reason to do a book like this?
I mean, from my perspective, we're at this sort of interesting point, and I can even use James Joyce because he's always my touchstone for things like this. So the James Joyce Quarterly, which was founded here in Tulsa at the University of Tulsa in 1963, was founded basically 80 years after Joyce died early, but it would have been just around Joyce's 80th birthday. So I don't think we should be surprised that just around Dylan's 80th birthday, we're sort of getting this moment of assessment, which is what this book is designed to do, and create that moment where we're kind of pivoting. And this is really what I see one of the core elements of this book is to pivot us from the hard and real and legitimate work that fans have been doing for 60 years with Bob Dylan, which always has a kind of deep emotional tie to the music, to the kind of work that I do as a scholar, which is to say, how does this fit into the larger puzzle of culture, of history, of answering that kind of question, to borrow a title of another book, like why Bob Dylan matters, right? Fans don't ever have to ask that question. They know why Bob Dylan matters. It was there for their breakup or their divorce or when they fell in love or, when they first dropped acid, whatever it might be, right? Like these songs have huge emotional connections for them and you can't argue them out of it because it's not a kind of feeling that's susceptible to argument. A book like this is meant to sort of be that moment where we take our first step back and say, look, probably from this period, we're going to remember 50 years from now, we'll remember from the latter half of the 20th century, 5 or 6 performers. They'll be the ones who get taught. They'll be the ones that are in our textbooks. They'll be the ones that when we say this is who is representative of that period in terms of what popular music was. Dylan's probably going to be that guy. And I think the reason is, again, the sort of other element of this book, which is Dylan is not just one thing, right? His influence touches nearly every aspect of the latter half of the 20th century in terms of culture, right? So that when Kazuo Ishiguro wins the Nobel Prize or when Salman Rushdie wins the Nobel Prize, they stand up and say, this is thanks in part to Bob Dylan. Like, he opened my mind as to what I thought popular culture could do. Like, it's why Salman Rushdie and Ishiguro can write literary fiction that has this like popular culture element to it, which is one of the things that makes their writing so distinct. And they said, Dylan taught us to do that kind of thing. Dylan was a leader in the civil rights movement, right? His songs are still these active living things, so that at the Women's March in Washington 3 years ago, Regina Spektor played Blowin' in the Wind, right, to this massive crowd that could sing along in a kind of moment of anti-Trump protest. And so there aren't many other songs, I don't think, in our culture that could do that work at that moment. And that's really what this book is trying to do, is to say, look, there's not one Dylan. There may be the Dylan you love. There are 27 chapters here by philosophers, marketing professors, English professors, music professors, each of them saying his stuff fits in each of our realms in a different way. And here's why Dylan matters to me as a marketer. Here's why it matters to me as a scholar of country music, right? Here's why it matters to me as a guy who thinks about the history of literary prizes.
That's so funny. You were mentioning the idea of kind of that idea of what lasts and what carries on. And I was trying to think, Dylan, for example, has had songs even over the last 20, 25 years, had a song that was a #1 hit from Garth Brooks, who did a cover, and also was a #1 hit from Adele with the same song, who did a cover, and like, who else could do that, right? Where they have the Dylan version, then a country version, then Adele does her thing that she does and introduces that song to an audience that probably has no idea who, or what Bob Dylan is or does, but it doesn't really matter if they connect with the song, right?
Yeah.
That's where it gets that emotional thing, right? It's the core. It doesn't, if a song hits you, it doesn't matter if you know who wrote it or what it was. It's that essence of the thing that kind of hits you at your core,
And that's, I mean, to me, and again, this goes back to that, the Nobel Prize, like not wanting to accept it. This is what makes Dylan different, is that notion of the cover song. And I can give you a funny anecdote. When they brought me in and said, we need to start a Dylan Institute or whatever. And so we're going to announce this pretty soon. So we need to be teaching a Dylan course. Can you start one? Because we need to be teaching it when it gets announced, so we actually know what we're doing. So I hastily prepared a Dylan class. And on the first day, I thought it was going to be brilliant. I had this great opening day, get the students hooked thing. We were going to talk about Tangled Up in Blue. 30 students are right in front of me. And we started in and they're like, we've never heard this song before. And I thought, oh man, this is terrible. Okay. I'll pivot real quick. We'll do Blowin' in the Wind. I'm sure you've all heard Blowin' in the Wind. 29 blank faces had not heard Blowin' in the Wind. One kid raised her hand and said, oh, I know this song, but it's not a Bob Dylan song. That's a Peter, Paul, and Mary song. and they are the ones who had made it famous, to be fair. And my grandparents owned that. And I was like, okay, I really have to rethink quickly. So I want you to all go home. I want you to pick 1 or 2 of your favorite artists and see if they've covered a Bob Dylan song and come in and talk about that. And as you were saying, that was the moment. Like, they all came in, I can't believe Adele, like Garth Brooks, all the names you name, everybody's covered a Bob Dylan song, because the songs can live in other musicians, right? In a way that other kinds of literature can't. And that the way that they live in there and the way that like they can make us, one of my students who's an 18-year-old and who's born after 2001, like suddenly connect to a song that was written in 1963. That's a wild kind of thing to see happen in a classroom, this kind of bridging of time. And it's because of the flexibility, I think, of Dylan's lyrics, of the ways in which they can get inside our head. You know, it was an astonishing thing to see.
Well, you know, and it's funny, you know, because it'd be like if in 1963 you were teaching like post Reconstruction songs to high school kids and trying to make them connect to it. You don't
Yeah.
think of time differently, right? It's like the mid-century to us kind of seems more recent than, you know, certain times when you kind of, it's kind of like, you know, I turned 40 this last year, and someone told me like that one of the shows I loved when I was a kid was The Wonder Years, right? And it was set in the 80s, or it was shot in the 80s, but it was like set in the mid 60s. And someone said, if that was filmed now, it would be basically set during around like 9/11, you know? And you don't think about that kind of thing because the 80s and the 60s seem like so different. Anyway, time's a tricky thing. But I'm curious with the, once you had this idea for the collection, you have to start gathering writers, right? Um, and there are a bazillion people who've written well about Bob Dylan, but you don't want to just kind of mine the same spaces exactly. How did you kind of start putting your bench together in terms of who was going to cover what?
Well, and you know, in some sense, this was easy in some sense, in that I knew I didn't want all those familiar voices in this book. And one of the guiding principles in assembling the book was absolutely trying to find a much more diverse. I mean, there's a sense in which sometimes you think about who listens to Dylan. There's definitely a stereotype of a white guy in his 60s, right? And Dylan's not going to live if that's the only place that his music lives. So we wanted to make sure we were finding as diverse a cast of people as we could. So because I don't want Dylan to sort of get locked into sort of being the white male writer of the, you know, what would I say, the Philip Roth of the of the latter half of the 20th century. And Roth, of course, was famously furious when Dylan won the Nobel Prize because Roth was convinced that was his last chance to win it. They weren't going to give it to another American after Dylan. And so, and we knew we wanted a globally diverse cast. We wanted diversity in terms of gender and race. And so that was part of what drove us here, was to sort of cast this wider net and say, who's an interesting critic who may not have written yet about Dylan, right, but may have some really interesting stuff to say about him. And so, for example, Devin Powers, who wrote an essay in here, she's called The Bob Dylan Brand. She was actually a music writer. She's an African-American woman. She was a music writer for the Village Voice for years, and then went on and got her PhD in marketing, and now teaches in the business college at Temple University. And so she can bring both this like musical sensibility to what Dylan has done, as well as a sort of fascinating meditation on branding through Dylan, like Dylan as a marketable thing, and how that marketing has changed over the years. So we wanted people like that. We also knew we didn't want just academics. So we were able to get music writers like Rio Marcus and Ann Powers from NPR contributed an amazing essay to the volume on Dylan's body and how it's changed throughout the year. She has the best line in the whole book, called that she says, sometime in 1975, Bob Dylan took his shirt off, right? Like this moment when he stops being this mod hipster from the 60s and tries to blend into the sort of 70s rock ethos of hair bands and whatnot, fails spectacularly. Like, no, you know, he doesn't need to take his shirt off. So I think casting that broad net and trying to live up to this world of Dylan, not Dylan obsessives, but people that can say, oh yeah, I have a lot to say about Dylan. I've never written about him before, but I do have a lot to say because he connects to marketing, or he connects to the philosophy of justice. We've got a philosopher in here who talks about Dylan's songs about justice and policing and things. So that was really what drove us here, was that sense of diversity, of casting a broad net.
You know, whenever Dylan has had a chance to kind of expose parts of his persona or other things, to be honest, there's just a lot of bullshit that you have to wade through. And so his book, his memoir, is parts of it seem kind of fabricated. The film that he made, Masked and Anonymous, is kind of this interesting send up of how people might make a movie about someone like him. And even this last year, you know, Martin Scorsese's in Oklahoma right now filming Killers of the Flower Moon, but just a year or two ago, he released this documentary about the Rolling Thunder Review, which of course has lots of real footage in there, but lots of the interviews are totally fabricated. And there's all kinds of crazy stuff. So it's like this blurring of myth and all these things. How do you kind of know what to trust, I guess? Maybe just from a sheerly, academic point of view, how can you teach some certain things if you don't know what's real or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge, and it's also a question of like, so what are we actually trying to teach, and what is Dylan actually trying to do, right? Because I think there's a way to say, yes, that's all true about Dylan, and it may really matter to you if you feel like you need to know Dylan. But I mean, the whole star system has always been built around this kind of, oh, there's the real person and the fake person. That's why we have like the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Like we all know this is like fake reality TV. It's pretty easy to say like Dylan was making reality TV in 1963 when he starts performing as Woody Guthrie, and then tossed that persona aside and puts on another one, right? He always understood there was this kind of duality to stardom, with fans always wanting to find the real person, and the real person there either wanting to conceal themselves, or I think more likely Dylan as a personality. I mean, it connects in an almost archetypal way, I would say, to this American concept of the flexible self, right? Walt Whitman, I Contain Multitudes. Right? This is the title of a song on Dylan's most recent album. Yep. And this idea, therefore, that you're going to pin him down, and that's what the job of a scholar is, to like poke the pins through the wings of a butterfly. Dylan's always kind of resisted that, right? The butterfly lives because it's moving, because it's changing. And so I'm not sure, honestly, there's a real Sean to go pin down. There may be a real Jeff. I wouldn't presume to speak for you, but I wouldn't want to have like 100 people trying to figure out who was I on Thursday and why am I so different on Saturday. And I think Dylan, it's just because Dylan's sort of been in the bright light of stardom from almost the moment he arrived at 19 years old in New York, that we somehow want him to be this one thing, when Dylan's genius is actually that ability to morph and change and say, I too am made of many pieces. My music is made of many pieces. America is made of many pieces. Trying to fix one of those things and say, this is the thing, is to fundamentally misunderstand Dylan, the music, and I think the country that he's trying, or the nation, the identity that he's constantly trying to explore in his artwork as well.
Well, and nothing, I guess, probably formed that in him more than that, super famous moment where, of course, he changed his music from acoustic to electric. The crowd just totally rejected it. And you have to think that created this kind of mercurial element in him to say, I'm never going to be, because he could have always been the folk hero guy, the March on Washington, civil rights song guy. He could have lived his whole career singing those songs, right?
Yeah.
He would have had a nice life, would have made a lot of money, would have done, he'd come back every year. There's an inauguration and play those songs on the steps of the Capitol or whatever. But he never did that. Of course, there's like the Christian music period. There's all these different things, some more successful than others. But you could never say he's had a boring career, right?
Yeah, and I think he does say, like, at one point later in his career, like when people are asking him about this question, he says something along the lines of, this won't be an exact quote, but basically, I don't want to be Fat Elvis. Like, I don't want to be the Dylan that goes to Vegas, has my name like on the casino, and plays the same 1963 version of my songs over and over and over again for this geriatric audience. Like, he didn't do that, right? Like, like going to a Dylan concert, as I said earlier, can be really fun if you understand the sort of game that's being played, or it can be enormously frustrating. You're never going to go to a concert and hear the version of the song that you heard on a record.
Or that
you're like, oh, can't you just play it once the old way? No, everything is new when you go. It's a performance every time. Some more successful than others, but it's a little like being in Edison's lab. Like, yeah, sometimes the stuff doesn't work, but sometimes you're there and he made a light bulb like right in front of you, and that's an amazing thing to see.
It's funny because it's almost more in line with, like, people expect that at a jazz concert, right?
Yeah.
They expect it even at like a Grateful Dead concert. You go to a Grateful Dead concert, you're going to hear the 12-minute version of an 8-minute song, and sometimes it's going to be a 17-minute version, and you kind of want that. So it's like we give that license to certain places for improvisation and changing things, but it's like the pop song kind of lives in amber in our mind. I don't know if that's because of radio or whatever, but yeah. And I have been frustrated at those concerts. I've seen him several times, and you're like, takes you 2 minutes to even realize what song it is sometimes.
Yeah.
like, oh, this is All Along the Watchtower, but I only know that because he said All Along the Watchtower or something. But it is an interesting thing. I'm curious, as you were putting the book together, you started kind of having other opportunities come to you, not just because of that, but because of the work you're doing here. You've got this cool BBC program coming out, which is a 5-part podcast radio show that covers the world of Bob Dylan, for lack of a better phrase. Talk about that and when we can listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that kind of came out of the blue. Is pretty exciting, and I think speaks to the global reach of Dylan's music and art too. I mean, it literally came as an email. I was sitting in a meeting that was really boring and checking my email, as one does in boring meetings, and an invitation from BBC to put together, would you be willing to write and narrate a 5-part series on Dylan's life for us? You seem like you might be the guy to ask. And I mean, it's a daunting thing, as you said, Jeff. Like, I can't tell you the story of Bob Dylan. I can tell you the kind of public story of Dylan, but I don't have any access to the guy. But yeah, and now it's, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to make it. It's going to broadcast all next week on the BBC in England. And Dylan's, the English have always had a real fascination with Dylan, right? That's where he was booed. That's more so than the US. That's where they called him Judas.
Yeah, if you watch Don't Look Back, that's mostly in England, I believe. Yeah.
And so many of Dylan's folk songs are folk songs derived from the English tradition. Dylan learned a lot playing music in England. So I mean, it makes a certain kind of sense. But yeah, I've got this opportunity using material from the archive. I draw particularly heavily on the Woodstock notebooks from 1966 to 1968, when Dylan is sort of withdrawn from the world and becomes morphs from the Dylan that we were describing earlier, that kind of rock and roll Dylan of Highway 61 revisited, to the Nashville skyline country music Dylan. You have notebooks where he's just kind of spending all day thinking about how to make music differently, and you can kind of trace that process in a way that makes scholars. I mean, I can say briefly, it's a super nerdy undertaking because he writes in all these little spiral bound notebooks that are about that big, and they'll drive scholars crazy for decades because he doesn't date them and he doesn't number them, and you have no idea, like, did he keep one in the workshop and one in the house and one next to the bed? Did he keep them in order? So, like, do we have to remix all the pages? There are like 4 or 5 different levels of ink. So, there's like green and orange and red, a pencil. Did he add the green ink 2 years ago before he sold, or 3 years ago, right before he sold the archive? Was it there originally? You can do all kinds of, we call it.
We're going to have to do like carbon dating on this stuff.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about. And so I've got access to I had access to those materials, and so I think can tell a really different kind of story about maybe what happened there as part of this larger retelling of Dylan's life that I've done.
That's very cool. And that comes out next week, you said?
It starts airing live on BBC next week, and then it'll be a podcast after that, and it may be broadcast on BBC America. I'm not sure yet.
I'll look forward to hearing that. We have another question. We were talking a minute ago about the Rolling Thunder Revue, which, of course, if people don't know, this was a concert series that Dylan went on in the mid-70s around the time of his album Desire. Kind of was wearing these kind of almost like gypsy style outfits, was wearing makeup, and had people like Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez came back out on the road, and people like Sam Shepard was part of, like, it was kind of this roving circus of interesting people. But one of our guests, John, asks, many scholars seem fascinated with the Rolling Thunder Revue period. During the world of Bob Dylan, those concerts seem to come up a lot. Did you get a sense of that, and how do you explain the fascination with that particular phase?
I mean, I guess the best I can do to answer a question like that is to say I can say what I find interesting about that phase. One, I mean, as the Scorsese movie makes clear, it is kind of coincident also with the bicentennial of America in 76. So Dylan's thinking about American history. And when you look at all those people he's on tour with, they're people who covered his songs and helped make him famous, right? So here's Dylan, like, sort of, it's either getting back together with the old gang, but also like, here are the people that found something in my music maybe that I didn't see even. And so I want to just hang out with them, make music together, and see what kind of alchemy that produces. And the tour itself was so fascinating. I mean, Dylan himself just drove a camper from town to town, and they went to, like, the first part of the tour was in historic American towns like Providence and Plymouth. They went to Jack Kerouac's grave and held a seance around it. It was clearly this attempt to think about the myth of America and their own that kind of traveling circus as somehow essential to the myth of America. That is, America is a thing that's in motion. It's not a place. It's not a set of people. It's not fixed in any one thing. It's instead this highly mobile thing, historically mobile, sort of spatially mobile, temporally mobile, so that it feels like when you're going to see the concert, they were deliberately staged in venues that were like the kind of places that the Big Bopper would have played, like high school gymnasiums and stuff. They weren't playing like big outdoor concerts. They literally went to like where rock and roll kind of started, and country music kind of started. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's so interesting, is it's Dylan's first real stock taking as a performer, and he was able to gather together this amazing group of people to sort of do that stock taking with him. I think that may be one of the things that makes that so interesting to him.
The moment that kind of gutted me the most in that documentary was where he and the band are at a native reservation, and he plays Johnny Cash's Ballad of Ira Hayes, or I guess it's written by another artist, but made famous by Johnny Cash, the Ballad of Ira Hayes, to this audience at this in this reservation. And it kind of bridged this moment where you kind of thought, he's at that point a dozen years kind of past that civil rights era period, but he still kind of had that thing. And this was also around the time of Hurricane, which was kind of a return to issues driven, very over, it's quite obvious that song had a purpose, was trying to do something. And he hadn't done a song like that in a while. And he hasn't really done anything quite like that since then. It's not as if there's like the Bob Dylan song about the AIDS crisis, or there's the Bob Dylan song about Iran-Contra, who knows what.
Yeah.
But then again, we don't quite know. There probably have been moments of that. It's just maybe more, subliminal in a certain sense. Do you feel like he's still commenting on issues of the day, or he just moved on to a bigger palette of like, I'm talking about America writ large instead of kind of one-off events?
Yeah, I think there's probably less interest in one-off events, or at least he's seeing those, and he's seeing one-off events in contemporary American culture through the frame that an 80-year-old can see it through, which is, this isn't new. Like, whatever, to make my own politics relatively explicit, right? Like, Trump isn't a new phenomenon in America. And so to release Murder Most Foul, on the verge of the election here was not an accidental thing. And it wasn't without sort of real political commentary attached to it. Like, What Did We Lose with Kennedy was a whole sort of sense of America being different than the sort of Make America Great Again, right? It was a different idea that Dylan was kind of holding up and mourning and saying, somehow we've lost this, and now we have to repeat it because we've lost it. Like, we have to live through that trauma again. And so I think you can definitely see that consistently in the music. He's never lost track of politics, but I don't think he thinks of politics as a specific event. And this came out for me when I was doing an interview with the Guardian newspaper in England. An older London interviewer was asking me about Dylan and why I thought he was important and so on. And I gave a response similar to what I've said here tonight about Dylan's ability to reflect on America. And he said, "Oh yes, I understand why you Americans like Dylan." He said, your country's not very old, and Dylan's been around for probably a third of its history, right? And so of course he can talk to you about your history, because you just don't have very much. And I was pretty pissed at the time. It seemed really snobby, but it's totally stuck with me, right? Like, I think he's kind of right in some ways.
Yeah. That's fascinating. We've got a few minutes left. I want to remind everybody, if you're watching, please pre-order this book. You're going to really enjoy. If you like this dorky Dylan talk you're listening to us just dive into right now, you're going to even love this even more. You can kind of lose yourself in it. And also you can listen to the music while you read it. So that's even better. I'm curious, there have been so many phases of Dylan over the years. What do you think is kind of still like one of the most underrated periods or albums or anything that you feel like still hasn't kind of gotten the credit it kind of deserves, or the reappraisal that it might get someday?
I suppose it's now happened a little bit, but for me, it's unquestionably the Christian era. Those three songs, or those three albums, starting with Slow Train, and I think they released a box set with some of the sort of the archival recordings around those years and what Dylan was doing, and regardless of how I happen to think about Dylan's religion, which is entirely the man's own business, I now understand that period and digging deeper and deeper into it because it's Dylan grappling with gospel music. And when I talk about Dylan thinking about the sort of racial origins of music, and he spent so much time thinking about the blues and thinking about minstrel shows, and really thinking in part about, up to that point in his career, about the ways in which these songs record Black suffering and the ways in which Dylan can then inhabit that suffering in a way we might call appropriation, to decry his own angst and frustration and anger. And that's what we find in a lot of those rock and roll songs, right? And what's missing there, of course, is gospel music, the songs of Black resilience, right? Of Black community, of Black striving. And of Black community, and that's what I think Dylan actually goes to find in that gospel music. So regardless of its religious content, it's Dylan finding this other aspect of American racial history that he then works and is still evident to me in much of his music. That's about not just music born out of suffering, but music born out of community and belonging and optimism and resilience and faith. And to me, that's why that music was derided at the time. Oh, he's betrayed us all, right? He's just converted to sort of hypocritically to this kind of evangelical form of Christianity, and it's not without its problems. There was homophobia clearly during that process for Dylan, but I think that grappling with the full richness of African American culture rather than African American music as just suffering, that transformed Dylan's music, and to me is still, as I said, evident in what we can listen to today. He learned his lesson well, to borrow a line from one of his songs.
Yeah, those albums, I don't have a religious bone in my body, and I can still find major beauty in a song like Every Grain of Sand. That's just a truly beautiful song. And there are moments like that throughout all those albums. I particularly love the two albums he put out. The 80s were rough, as you mentioned. The 80s were a rough period. I do love Oh Mercy, and I like some of that Traveling Wilbury stuff too. But he put out these two albums of traditional folk covers called World Gone Wrong and Good As I've Been to You, early 90s. And they're kind of not talked about at all, but they're just like solid kind of traditional folk albums. There's not like they're not ironic. It's just like, hey, I love these songs and good stuff if you haven't heard it, folks. So I want to say, just as a last question, obviously you're at the beginning in some ways of your Dylan journey. I mean, the center is not open. A lot of the stuff hasn't really been out there yet. What are you gonna keep doing with all this stuff?
I mean, I think, as I said, just that to go back to that 800,000 entries in an academic catalog here, like, it's not just me. Part of my job as the director of an institute, like the one that I run, is to help create the opportunities for lots of people to come and do stuff with this. And I think once the Dylan Center is open and once the Dylan archives are fully open, you're going to see this blossoming, really, of scholarship around Bob Dylan that's going to surprise us in all kinds of ways. As I said, we had just a smattering of that in this volume. When you get someone like Ann Powers from NPR coming in to write about, no one's really written about Dylan's sexuality or his body or the way that he performs masculinity. Like, that's just a little scratch on the surface of a huge set of questions that I think we can talk about in relationship to Dylan. And that's not even to talk about some of the things we didn't talk about today, like Dylan's interest in theater, in the visual arts, in painting, and in filmmaking. So, I think what we're going to find, and what I see my mission is for the coming years, is certainly to continue to do my own work. And I've got my own interests in Dylan that really center around those notebooks I've looked at from the Woodstock years. But far more interesting to me is opening this up as a possibility for lots of other scholarships to start asking those kind of big contextual questions about Dylan, about why Dylan mattered then, and about why Dylan's going to continue to matter. Right. Every time we get a Dylan cover, like an angel gets its wings, right? Like my life gets to continue more because there's like one more version now of this song to talk about, one more context to put it in, and that, in some sense, this is like an infinite treasure hoard for us to keep mining here.
Well, so everybody, you guys join us on our next episode. It's called Bob Dylan's Sex Symbol. That'll be a whole deep dive. Well, Sean, it's been great. I feel like I haven't seen you in so long in person, but it's been great to catch up and kind of get the band back together a little bit. And I can't, so excited for the book and can't wait to listen to the series. So everybody out there, make sure you guys get a copy, pre-order your copy of The World of Bob Dylan. Like I said, it drops technically on Dylan's birthday, but we'll be able to get it for you a little bit before that, so you can make it easy on yourself and just swing by and pick it up at the store, or we can just ship it out to you. And I just want to say a big thank you to all you for watching, and thank you to Sean for joining us tonight.
Thanks. It's been a real pleasure. Glad to be here.
All right. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. We'll see you soon.
Bye.